Welcome to Education on the Line, a podcast series focused on the threats facing public education and the strategies emerging to meet them. I'm Louis Friedberg. 8 years in a row. That's how long total enrollments in California's public schools have been falling statewide. And in many school districts, they have been falling for far longer than that. Nationally, projections show the school-age population declining most sharply between now and 2035, with no stabilization expected until the 2040s and perhaps even beyond that. By mid-century, public schools nationally could be educating between 5 and 8.5 million fewer students than they do today. In California recently, the funding squeeze driven by enrollment declines have become one of the main engines behind a wave of teacher strikes and threatened strikes that have created turmoil in districts like San Francisco, West Contra Costa Unified, San Diego, Oakland, and Los Angeles. And in the past year, teachers have been demanding wages that districts, often operating on shrinking attendance and shrinking revenues, increasingly cannot pay, and at times risking insolvency. And they have had to make hard decisions about closing schools, cutting programs, right-sizing a system built for a far larger population. So we're at an inflection point, and it raises a question that the majority of school leaders are now facing. What do you do when the problem isn't temporary? Today, we have three guests who know this terrain intimately, but from different vantage points. Julien LaFortune is a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California and is one of the most authoritative voices in California on the state's enrollment numbers and where they are headed. Welcome, Julien LaFortune.
Thanks, Louis. Great to be here.
Also, we're pleased to have with us Kyla Johnson-Trammell, who until last June was superintendent of Oakland Unified after spending 8 years in that post. She was truly a homegrown superintendent, having gone to elementary and middle school in the district and then serving for many years as a teacher, principal, and assistant superintendent there before becoming superintendent. She currently serves as superintendent in residence with the ILO Group, a women-owned education and policy consulting firm, and is on the faculty of the Forum for Educational Leadership, advising national education organizations on strategy and systems change. Welcome, Kyla Johnson-Trammell.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And also with us is Roxanne Fuentes, the current superintendent in the Beryessa Union School District, a 6,000-student K-8 school district in San Jose, California, where she too has had to come to terms with declining enrollments in her district. She has been a public school educator for 29 years as an elementary teacher, instructional coach, principal, and assistant superintendent of educational services. She is the first Latina superintendent of her district. Welcome, Roxanne Fuentes.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone.
Let me start with Julien LaFortune, a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, as we usually refer to it. Some people might say, well, having fewer kids in schools is not such a bad thing. Teachers can spend more time with them, they can get more attention, and so on. So why is this a problem? Because it appears to be a significant one.
At first glance, that inclination is right. We have fewer kids either in a district or in the system. That could potentially mean more money per kid, but it also means a smaller school system. And for a specific school district, that means you get less funding overall. Funding is on a per student basis. You may be able to provide, some additional resources if the state can give additional funding. But overall, you still have to downsize. And that's really quite painful often for districts to do. How do you, especially when declines are happening year after year, how do you manage a school system that's smaller? How do you make decisions about potentially closing schools or closing programs because you don't quite have the enrollment to support them, or perhaps splitting staff and other support staff across sites in a district? These are all difficult decisions, and this is, I think, one of the pain and kind of pressure points that districts are facing now, not just in California, but in a lot of states and districts across the country.
What are the main reasons that we are seeing these declining enrollments?
There are fewer kids in the system, and it's a long-running demographic trend mainly driven by lower birth rates and, also to an extent, especially in California, changing immigration and interstate migration patterns. We have, fewer kids being born in California. We also have a stagnating population with more people leaving the state than coming in. And that's been true for several decades. And for a while, immigration, into California was a counterbalance to some of those migration trends. But how immigration will look over the coming years is something that's also changing very quickly on top of these birth rate and general trends in the aging population that we've been seeing.
Let me ask you about private schools. Is that one of the reasons, one of the factors that is contributing to this decline?
So I can say at least in California, it's a factor, but it's a relatively minor factor. It was a bigger deal perhaps during and after the pandemic when there were a greater share of kids maybe switching to private school or doing homeschool or other kind of options, especially during periods of remote learning when there was a lot of dissatisfaction with current school options. That's definitely something we saw in the data.
What about charter schools? I know there's some confusion there. Sometimes the numbers that are reported for districts include charter schools, sometimes they don't. Do these numbers that you are projecting include charter school enrollments?
The work that we've done and when kind of big picture statewide numbers are reported on enrollment decline, it's often including charter schools, so including students in either traditional public schools or charter schools. Now, at an individual district level, that can be a much bigger issue, right? If you are a district and you have a lot of competition with local charters and you lose enrollment, that's an issue not for statewide funding and how many students there are statewide, but that's an issue for the funding in that district, right? Whether that student is coming to the traditional district or attending a nearby charter.
So it does make a difference in school districts that have large charter school enrollments.
Yeah, so it's uneven across the state. I think this is a bigger issue, especially in kind of large urban contexts where there's just a higher share of charter schools in general.
You mentioned uneven. I think this is another complicating factor because some school districts are seeing increases in enrollment. So could you just give us a sense of how many school districts are experiencing declining enrollments and why are some school districts actually increasing enrollments?
A little over half of districts saw an enrollment decline. About 43% or so actually experienced growth. Now, growing districts, the vast majority of those are not growing by a lot, maybe by a couple percent or a few percent, less than kind of a 5% year over year change. There really aren't huge swings in enrollment. Majority of districts are falling, but they're not falling drastically in any given year. It's really this uneven picture. And I think that's what makes it challenging from a state perspective. How do you deal with a shrinking student population? Well, it's not shrinking everywhere, right? And so how you choose to financially support or not districts undergoing these transitions also means potentially leaving out money for areas where student populations are growing, perhaps due to, economic growth in an area or people leaving high-cost coastal areas to more affordable inland areas of the state.
And your research has shown that disproportionately, the enrollments are declining at school districts that are serving a larger proportion of low-income students and more Latino, African-American students, which of course compounds the pain because those are school districts that are often struggling financially.
Yeah, exactly. And just something else we've seen in the data on that point, larger declines where there are lower income students, English learner students. For a long time, we had large levels of immigration into the state and very high birth rates, specifically among the non-native born Latino population. Birth rates have declined relatively more. And I think that all is kind of compounding these cost of living concerns across, these coastal and urban areas as well, influencing not just whether individuals stay in those areas or move to have families, but perhaps how many children they choose to have as well, or whether they choose to have any children.
We haven't mentioned President Trump yet. However, and you mentioned immigration, obviously a major factor in California, many other states. Isn't this going to contribute significantly to the enrollment declines if you're going to have fewer immigrant kids coming into states that have previously been high immigration states?
I mean, it certainly could. And I think if there is a big decline in immigration, that is something that will eventually have an impact on enrollment. And the reason I say eventually is because a lot of these factors, some of these demographic factors, move somewhat slowly.
What have you seen in terms of how school districts have or haven't responded?
The most controversial type of change, and the change people are most often concerned about, and what we get a lot of questions about, is will this lead to a big wave of school closures? And I'll just say, when we looked at the data, you don't tend to see that there actually were a significant amount of school closures disproportionately in these districts that have had declining enrollment or had longer periods of declining enrollment. What does that mean? Districts are tending not to close schools, on average operate them perhaps with just fewer students. That's the one surprising data point that we have.
Because closing schools is one of the most difficult things any school superintendent or school board can do. Usually there's just a lot of opposition.
Yeah, no one wants to be known as the superintendent or the board that closed schools. And what we've seen in the data is that districts tend to delay that choice perhaps as long as they can.
What I've also seen is that teachers' unions want to protect jobs. And so they will fight layoffs of any kind. To what extent do you think that school districts have not really caught up with this declining enrollment? The term I hear often is right-sizing the district to match the enrollment declines.
For a while, districts haven't really had to grapple, or at least the financial pressures haven't been such that they have to grapple with really significantly downsizing the number of staff. One of the challenges when it comes to some of the kind of big and consequential decision about whether you close a school site, whether you close a school, how, can you provide actually perhaps more services if they're consolidated at one site rather than spreading your resources more thinly across many school sites? How do you balance that, though, against the kind of history of a neighborhood, preserving these community ties? Those are difficult questions.
On that note, I want to thank Julien LaFortune. He is a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
So let's bring in the two superintendents who've been in the trenches in dealing with the challenges presented by declining enrollment. Let's start with Kyla Johnson-Trammell, who until a year ago was superintendent in Oakland. I know you were able to close some schools in the district in 2023. Just give us some thoughts on the school closing strategy and the difficulties of executing it.
What I would say is that when you're looking at declining enrollment, even if closing schools and consolidating schools has to be a part of your strategy, it's really a defensive strategy. And so you also need an offensive strategy, which is understanding why parents may not be selecting your suite of schools and having a deep understanding at an individual basis of what students and families are wanting in your different neighborhoods. So even if it helps you to remain solvent, right, it doesn't in and of itself address the issue of low quality and understanding what maybe you aren't offering that you need to improve. So after you're able to stop the bleeding, so to speak, you're able to attract families. So it's both a heads and a tail type of a situation. And anytime you're taking away from a community, whether it's a school or whether it's layoffs, right, there's a grieving process. And in certain communities where that has been a strategy over time, you have to have a deep understanding that there's scar tissue there. If there were attempts before you got there that maybe didn't go so smoothly, if there were buildings that were left and they were vacant, and so they added blight to certain communities that already have historically dealt with a lot of economic issues, you have to sit in that and listen to that and figure out the appropriate strategies.
Let me ask you about in Oakland, to what extent was declining enrollment and is declining enrollment one of the driving factors on so many of the challenges you had to face? I mean, you were dealing with a district that had to get a bailout from the state in 2003. And I should mention, during your tenure, the district was able to pay off that loan after about 20 years, but is still facing a big deficit. To what extent was those budget problems related to declining enrollments versus other factors?
I would say that declining enrollment is the central issue that the district is still addressing. For the most part, the number of schools that the system hasn't significantly changed since the early 2000s. I think one piece that's slightly different in Oakland was the proliferation of new schools that were built in the early 2000s. One, through the gift of the Gates Foundation and the small school movement, which added more small schools, many of them that have turned out to be incredibly successful and increase opportunity for students and families in areas where historically that hadn't been the case for decades. But there were some schools that didn't end up being successful. Some of those needed to be closed. At the same time, that is also when the charter movement increased. So in some areas, you had both more district schools and charter schools. So just that immense creation of schools, again, trying to figure out how to give families that historically didn't have quality options more places to choose without addressing the fact that, particularly on the district side, once the Gates money expired, there wasn't the district capability to consume and continue to support operationally this significant increase of schools. What that means is that you're continuing to invest less in some of the quality pieces that you need to have a quality school, whether it's on the academic side, school culture side, extracurricular side, or just other programming, because each school receives less money. With having many schools that you're still having to maintain, and with the enrollment not being on an increased trajectory since the early 2000s.
And we'll be going to Dr. Roxanne Fuentes of the Beryessa Union School District shortly, a much smaller school district. One of the things to remember in this conversation is that there are so many differences between districts. So what might work in one district might not work in another. You have a large number of charter schools, which contributed to the declining numbers in the regular schools, right? And that I'm sure that had a big impact on your finances.
So I would say in the early 2000s, absolutely, that's when charters were growing. You could visibly see many families leaving the system. But now many of our charter organizations are also experiencing declining enrollment. They also are closing or merging, particularly after COVID. There were more families that decided they wanted the homeschooling environment. They wanted virtual school. Nationwide, we know there are a lot of African-American families, Asian-American families that were choosing homeschool. Many families may have decided to go private. Some families decided to go charter, and then many families leaving the Bay Area just given the cost of living. So it's a lot of different dynamics. And so that all the families are moving to charters, that argument doesn't pan out as the driving force when that network of schools is also experiencing declining enrollment.
Well, let me go then to Roxanne Fuentes from the Beryessa Union School District. Roxanne, could you just fill us in a little bit about your district, which is very close to Oakland, but very different?
Correct, absolutely. And like Dr. Johnson-Trammell explained, really understanding your community's history is so critical on how you navigate these challenging issues. You know, Beryessa, we're in North San Jose area, predominantly middle-class neighborhood.
You also had to close schools. How were you able to accomplish this in your district?
It's incredibly an emotional issue, right? You're talking about beloved neighborhood schools that are the hub for family gatherings and just so many different support networks in a school culture. For us, it was really important to show our community that this was a last resort, prior to going down the school consolidation process, which for us was about almost a year long process. We had gone through 2 years prior of budget stabilization committee work and really reviewing our budget. We had, in addition to declining enrollment, we also had a structural deficit that we were having to address. And that became more prominent once the one-time dollars went away from our pandemic experience. So we really needed to, make some hard decisions. And so we made all of that as public and as transparent as possible, knowing though that there's going to be disagreement with your numbers, there's going to be disagreement with the data, and we certainly received some of that feedback, but we did our best to bring our community along with us and help educate them on our budget, number one, and how we were funded and why we were experiencing these struggles. As schools get smaller and smaller, we all know combination classrooms are a necessary evil, but when a child is experiencing a combination classroom in first grade, second grade, and third grade, that is no longer the best educational environment for that child. And when you get into the secondary schools, middle schools, and high schools, now that's affecting your elective course offerings. And we know that, our parents want more for their kids. And so we really had to share how, by going in this direction, our number one priority was to improve programs and support services to kids.
And did that argument, were you able to convince people?
Not everyone. We definitely got opposition, but the opposition wasn't based on the need to consolidate or close schools. I think we did a great job there, and our community understood that that was the last resort and the only choice we had left to be able to get our fiscal situation where we needed to be and to be able to do what we wanted for kids. Where the opposition came was when you're talking about which schools are going to be the impacted schools, right? Because everyone thinks it's going to be that school, not my school. There was quite a bit of opposition. We understand the district needs to do this, but please don't pick my school. And we understand that passion.
Let me ask Kyla Johnson-Trammell from Oakland, because I do recall you making this argument that by closing schools, the schools that would then have larger enrollments would actually be better schools, that the students would be better served. A lot of people didn't buy that. Could you just share with us, how does one get that message across?
For Oakland, a lot of the frustration, unlike in other communities, is that the community had experienced rounds of consolidations. And a lot of that had to do with the great level of leadership instability. Before I got there, the average tenure of the superintendent was about 1.5 years. So if you put yourself in the shoes of someone who's been a teacher, a principal, who's lived in the community, and every 2 years, right, you've got this disruptive process happening, there's some scar tissue, there's some trauma, there's some pain. And so even though people can understand the economic and the logic of the more schools you have, the less you can invest, which means folks in the community, and Dr. Fuentes gave a great example, right? It doesn't take a rocket science to figure out. You wouldn't want to have a school so small that kids are in a combination class the entire year. 2, that teachers probably aren't going to stay in that kind of community because you don't have that many people to collaborate with, right? Because the school's small. But people can understand the economics and the logic, but still be drawn to make the decisions based on their emotions, based on how they feel, right? Based on, I haven't seen a track record of the organization doing this well. So for Oakland and for some other districts where this has been a persistent problem, that's the complexity of how you have to sit in that, literally sit in the occupied building, sit with people in the hunger strike, and absorb and listen to the pain and the frustration and honor that and recognize that and try to figure out a way forward. So both things can be true.
We started the discussion talking about closing schools. I'm sure that's the last thing you as superintendents want to do. What are some of the other things that you considered and that other superintendents and other school boards should consider?
You certainly need to solicit your community feedback from staff, from parents, to find out what's missing for them, to be able to really identify what do we need to develop, what do we need to help grow, what currently exists that's successful, that, we can expand. You look at specialized programs, you look at dual immersion, you look at all of those options that could be attractive for families. And we had done that in Beryessa. We began Mandarin dual immersion program at a site that had been declining in enrollment, and that certainly helped recruit more students and families to the area. Then you look at existing space as well, and can we generate new revenue through potential leasing partnerships and things of that nature. It's not just always about making cuts and reductions, but also looking at how you can generate more funds. You're looking at everything.
That's Roxanne Fuentes, a superintendent in the Beryessa Union School District. Kyla Johnson-Trammell, what are some of the things you consider to deal with this declining enrollment challenge?
Even schools that are doing a solid job, parents are more educated now in terms of their choices that they have. And particularly in a declining enrollment environment, you have the choice of the school that's in your neighborhood. You have the choice of schools in other parts of your system. You have the choice of schools if they're charters, but you also have the choice to ask for an interdistrict transfer and go to another district. And so some of it is providing support to your school leaders to understand part of your role actually is marketing and being able to communicate the vision of why should I send my kid to your school? What is it about your school that makes it a good quality school? And so as you understand the consumer, which is the student and the parent, and what are the things that they're looking for, again, the same way you use data to drive student achievement, you're using that information to think with the few dollars that we have, where should we place them to increase the number of families that are still there? In our community, we've had some neighborhoods where there's gentrification. It's a totally different demographic that may live there now versus 10, 15 years ago. Is the school aware of that? Are they assuming they can attract the families that may live there now, the same way the families that may have lived there 15 years ago? Or do you have to be in the community, have coffee chats, talk to the community so you stay relevant in terms of the families that live there now, what are they looking for?
And were you able to expand some of those choices that you're talking about?
Obviously not as much as I would have liked to, because there's so many factors. When I was a principal, many families were like, we love your school, but if you aren't able to offer after school programming, that in and of itself is a non-starter. I'm a working parent, right? The challenge is we could see over time that the percentage of declining enrollment was decreasing, but it was never enough to shift where the district was actually increasing because of all of the housing pressures, which is still an issue, both for families, but as we know, that's a huge piece of a lot of the stripes. And so there are some bigger conversations, because I do worry about every individual LEA being able to resolve this when this external pressure of just particularly places that are near the Bay Area or LA or San Diego, they're just so expensive and it's becoming financially untenable for families and also folks who work in the public sector.
And in many other parts of the country. And,
Absolutely.
And I just say LEA, Local Education Agency. I don't want to let you go before asking you about the issue of convincing the teachers and the union representatives that this issue of declining enrollments really does make a difference. Because what I've seen in so many districts, the union's representatives, can't speak for all the teachers, just don't accept that this is really what's driving a lot of these budget cuts. How does one convince the people on the other side of the bargaining table that these are real issues? Because it's clear that Oakland has lost large number of students. It's almost half the size that it was in the 60s. And Beryessa, I think, it lost to 1/3 of your students. So how do you get that argument across?
Well, I think one thing I'd share is just, it's really important to make sure you're having ongoing open conversations and being as candid as possible with them. There is always that tension of, do they believe your data? Do they not? But I think it's really, really important to make sure that door is always open for opportunity to question and to talk and to continue to navigate. I was fortunate to have our unions working in collaboration with us. They care deeply about what's the impact going to be on their members. And we spent a lot of time talking about what that could look like, what would be the supports that members would need, because the bottom line was, for us in our situation, by merging and closing schools, we were going to be laying off staff as a result. We try to be very empathetic about understanding that you could have, a teacher who's been in their classroom teaching kindergarten for 30 years. That's home. That is home. A person with that much years of experience in the district wasn't going to be at risk of losing their job, but they weren't going to be in that school anymore. They were going to be in a whole new place, a whole new school culture. It's a lot of change for people, and just really understanding change dynamics and the impact of that for everyone, and letting your labor partners know, we get that. We understand, that anxiety.
Kyla Johnson-Trammell, just in terms of how you convince the people on the other side of the bargaining table that these pressures are real, that this does make a difference, the declining enrollments.
It all comes down to ongoing communication, even with a really tense conversation. And I think even broadening it beyond labor and bringing in schools and bringing in parents, right, to really understand the trade-offs, to really understand economies of scale. And again, when you're stepping into a district where there have been a lot of consolidations over 10 years, and a lot of bad blood, and a lot of just horrible memories of that, and maybe some iterations that didn't go well, where there wasn't a lot of communication, you have to go through that, listen to that, and have that open conversation. There's no silver bullet. This isn't for wimps. You have to be honest and, deal with the pain that may be there, but also as you're getting smaller, do you have strategies, and are you listening to the community in terms of what they're saying they want? We want better facilities. We want more academic support, right? So that people can actually feel that the experience afterwards is better.
Well, we've run out of time, but before I let you go, what is the one piece of advice that you would put forward for school leaders who are traversing this landscape, which is going to be with us for many, many years? Let's start with Dr. Fuentes.
We didn't really talk about our school board members, but they're key. Really having some heartfelt conversations with each trustee to be sure that they also have the stamina to go down this path and make those hard decisions. That would be key. And then I think in terms of what gives me hope, well, it's always the children, because I can tell you with all the changes that we made in Beryessa, the kids are doing just fine. They're resilient. We had lots of good supports for them, and they made a great transition. Change is always more difficult for us adults, and that's okay, and we'll work with all of our adults in the system. But the children, we stay focused on them. That's why we make these hard decisions, to ensure that they thrive and they continue to thrive. And we want to make sure that we have the resources to be able to do that for them.
Kyla Johnson-Trammell, what gives you hope?
The fact that it's our moral imperative to continue to find ways to provide all students a high quality education. I think that just has to be the drive to get through this moment. But bringing creativity and innovation by opening the conversation up and making sure labor board members, but also community, industry that's in your area, community-based organizations, because there are always ways of thinking about approaching the problem, approaching the communication, approaching the design and implementation when you have a diverse group noodling on the problem that can get you places that are better for the school and the community.
I want to thank Kyla Johnson-Trammell, who until last year was superintendent of Oakland Unified. After spending 8 years in that post, she currently serves as superintendent in residence with the ILO group and is on the faculty of the Forum for Educational Leadership. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also I want to thank Roxanne Fuentes, the current superintendent in the Beryessa Union School District near San Jose. Thanks so much for your insights.
Thank you. Appreciate the conversation.
And on that note, we have to bring this episode of Education on the Line to a close. Our producer is Kobe McDonald, and our advisor is Pedro Noguera, Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education. And please subscribe to Education on the Line wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Louis Friedberg. Thanks for joining us.